Okay, I just want to welcome everyone here to UCR Riverside. We're really happy to see you all. It's really gratifying to see the civic spirit embodied by everybody coming here today. Nice Friday morning, and it's really great to feel this engagement between the public sector and those folks out there in the private sector and us academics here at UCR Riverside. It's just really thrilling to see this genuine intellectual and public engagement with each other, and I hope our conversation today very much feels in that spirit. My name is David Brady. I'm the director of the Blum initiative here at UC Riverside, and we're an initiative that focuses on poverty both globally, but also here in the local region, inland and Southern California. And we're really delighted to do this seminar today on affordability issues and how it relates to water, but also all kinds of costs for families and households. And right now I'm going to turn it over to our welcoming remarks from Joaquin Esquivel. But then following that, we're going to have two 25-minute presentations, and we're going to ask that questions be held to the end of those presentations, and then we'll have a broader, open, freewheeling, moderated discussion with a few other members of the discussion. And so we'll start off with Joaquin, and then we're going to turn to Kurt Schwabing, followed by Giovanna Rosen to talk about some presentations, about 25 minutes each. And like I said, we should have ample time for discussion, and we would enthusiastically welcome and encourage questions, discussion from the audience, and so forth. So why don't I turn it over to Joaquin, who is, oh, there he is. There you see it. Sorry.
We'll see. I'll stand here first, and then if I get restless, I'll walk. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. I was appointed chair a year ago, and first joined the board about 3 years ago, having previously been appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to the State Water Board. Prior to doing that, I was in the Governor's Washington, D.C. office, focusing on federal water policy and trying to work with them, the Obama administration, to get some synergy and nexus between some of the water policy that was going on in the thick of the drought here in the state of California with our federal counterparts. Before that, I was with Senator Boxer's office for about 8.5 years, and I started as an intern in her office and somehow just stayed. I was an English major at UC Santa Barbara, so I didn't have a poli-sci background. I wasn't, at all kind of aware of much of anything east of the Sierra Nevada, like a good Californian. I was actually born and raised in the Coachella Valley, La Quinta, and so I was actually at the University of California, Washington, D.C. program, UCDC, that brought me to D.C. Then I saw a flyer and I thought, why not? And so I come to the board certainly at an interesting time. The State Water Resources Control Board, just for a quick gloss, has a regulatory purview, and we are under the California Environmental Protection Agency as our umbrella agency, but has a regulatory purview over all water quality regulation in the state of California. And we accomplish that water quality regulatory work with our 9 regional water quality control boards, and then also oversee and administer the state's water rights. And then, as of 5 years ago, have the Division of Drinking Water transferred over from Department of Public Health, those were previously us. So the State Water Board is, when it was first created by then Governor Reagan in the legislature in 1969 or 68, was brought together with previously local pollution control boards and a water rights office. And it said, if you're going to regulate water, you have to do so with quantity and quality at the same time. You can't separate the two. You have to do them together. The Port of Blum Act, as it was known, actually predates the Clean Water Act and was the model in many ways, similar to our sister agency at CARB, who's enacting legislation predates the Clean Air Act. So the State Water Board is this very interesting institution, certainly when it comes to California. And when the Division of Drinking Water was brought over 5 years ago, it really kind of even further evolved what is what I would be very proud of as a regulatory entity that is we've been able to, over the last decades, improve the quality of our rivers and streams and lakes and estuaries and bays far greater to, to the point that we've actually rated them, that is. I'll kind of make a quick point on that and remind us all that for millennia, roughly 300,000 individuals live here on this place that we call California. And so the fact that there are now nearly 40 million of us on this same space brings with it certain challenges. And so the State Water Board has been trying to remediate some of those challenges on the quality side and continue to try to undertake on the quantity side and our water rights regulation sort of a more cogent system, but becoming a public health entity with the Division of Drinking Water. I think has again evolved us and allowed for the space to say, how do you better regulate water quality and the watershed scale, which are sources of drinking water, both above and below ground, with quantity and water rights administration, and be protective of public health and drinking water. How do you link those systems, knowing that they are linked? That you look at the watersheds that are the Sierra Nevada and the various watersheds that feed, and these sources that are the drinking water sources for our cities, that irrigate our agriculture. They come through, they go into our cities, they go down our toilets and go out wastewater treatment plants and out onto rivers and picked up later on in the system. It is what is a pretty cyclical system in and of itself. So how do we, as a regulatory entity, start to innovate in some of that space? And I feel that is where we have some of our greatest opportunities. When we talk about affordability, and I'll go back to my previous point that we're inheritors of this interesting system that, again, for millennia supported 300,000 or so, and now we have this 40 million. And we've developed all of this, our local water projects, our state water projects, rim dams, the entire built infrastructure that supports what we are, fifth largest economy, source of incredible innovation, agriculture that is world dependent, and it comes with, again, certain legacies and certain inheritances that we have to overcome, and they cost money. And so when we talk about even the built infrastructure of our drinking water systems and our wastewater systems, those came with incredible federal investment decades ago that has now transitioned to local ratepayers who are responsible to maintain that aging infrastructure. And so that too is part of what is this inherited legacy. So at the landscape level, whether we're talking about our dams, our reservoirs, the larger components that feed what come down to our taps and then back out. We need to see a generational reinvestment. We need to acknowledge that there has been a shift away from federal dollars that were so critical to build all out what we have, and that now what we have is an increasing burden on ratepayers, increasing burden on communities to maintain those systems, upgrade those systems, make those systems more resilient to what we know are not just the inherited sort of challenges that we have in our water sector, but those that we can see down the line due to climate change. That's the greatest ones that really challenges what will be the affordability of all of this system that we've come to very much depend on all for the moment. So, I'll touch really quickly that whether it's PFAS or microplastics or chromium-6, which is an NCL that is not currently in place but will be coming back, there are emerging contaminants of concern that we will continue to have to address. And going back to the theme of inherited legacies and the costs of those, part of that is, to be candid, a broken chemicals regulatory infrastructure that doesn't have a precautionary principle that allows for the use of certain chemicals that we then later come to find are impactful on human health or toxic to human health, and have to then pay for its cleanup And so, so I think that those will be drivers of affordability, certainly in our communities as we begin to understand more about our built environment, as we begin to analyze and see additional things that need to be addressed. But there needs to be a discussion as to how do you prioritize what can become, in a sense, of a very overwhelming amount of treatment, of new contaminants, but the option can't be, well, let's stop understanding or finding out that there are these challenges and trying to address them. But there is certainly a hint of it, and I certainly experienced it. So I really just want to appreciate and thank everyone here for, one, letting me open with a few thoughts here on what is sort of a meta affordability, but I think the larger bigger picture affordability challenges that we have, and drilling down now into maybe some specific numbers, which I know, and I want to thank Kurt for his work with Paul Jones, who I want to acknowledge as well, here at the Municipal Water District, around what does affordability look like, what are the metrics, how do we quantify it, and how do we continue to keep rates low in the face of these challenges? Because we often talk in the state of California about human right to water. It was passed in 2012. The state of California was the first state in the nation to have a human right to water in the water code. Not only put air quotes around it because of anything other than it came with some problems. It said, it basically said that it isn't in spirit that we have a human right to water and doesn't actually put us on the hook for any real dollars. But it did mean, though, that it meant our agencies had to make real what the human right to water is and how we start to really build in and understand what the challenge is, which we know is 1 million Californians without access to clean and safe drinking water, and how we then sort of address that in a comprehensive way. And it's challenging because it's not just a technical challenge, it's not just a dollars challenge. These are human challenges, because oftentimes what you'll find is these are communities that have purposely not been extended service, that have otherwise maybe neighbors that do have functioning systems, and it points to the necessary regionalization that has to happen once our systems. I'll just try to quickly finish here, but I'll just say that we regulate at the State Water Board well over 3,000 drinking water systems here in the state of California. If you extend the number of drinking water systems we have in the state to those that serve below 25 connections, which are outside of our purview, but at the county's purview, that number goes up to 7,000. And so the issue around affordability, regionalization, and resiliency is scale. You need to have, and you all here in Southern California well know, you need to have the ratepayer base to even address things like PFAS or maintain a system and continue to reinvest into it as it ages. And if you don't, and you see this in Flint and the east and back east, or other systems that have depopulation happening, so a ratepayer base is not, you get folks falling out a lot, folks not being served in the state. And so we are endeavoring on that with the Safety Global Fund that we were given recently in a program around that. And it impacts affordability. Central to that program will be affordability. So just thank you again for the opportunity to give some remarks here. I appreciate everyone's interest here, and I will be listening actively to the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. So just a couple of moments before I introduce Kurt, I just wanted to say a little bit about what we do with the Blum initiative here at UC Riverside. And like I said, we have a focus both on global and regional local issues about poverty, but really driving a lot of this is a theme that's very central to today's discussion. And we try to understand how do families, how do households make ends meet? How do they afford the necessities of life and what it means to be poor and lack the resources you need? And we're very interested in nonpartisan and objective scientific research that can hopefully drive a richer public conversation about these issues. As one example, we're doing a survey where we're interviewing all the California state legislators, and we ask them questions like, what does it take to ends meet? How much money does a family need? We also ask questions about what are the biggest needs that families face? Are they healthcare costs, housing costs, food costs, what have you? And so in that spirit, we very much hope to cultivate a dialogue here, and I'm going to turn it over now to Kurt Schwabe, my colleague in the School of Public Policy, and he's going to talk about some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. You have a clicker by any chance? Kurt Schwabe, I'm Associate Dean and Professor of Environmental Economics and Policy in the School of Public Policy here at UC Riverside. Certainly want to thank Chairman Escobar for coming down and giving us some useful, critical, and important thoughts on this issue. Very timely. I also want to thank Paul Jones and Eastern Municipal Water District staff for funding this study, especially the data. They're so easy to work with. It's been great. I have to just thank you, your staff. Thank you, David Brady and Dr. Justine Ross for putting this symposium together today, and also my co-author, Dr. Mehdi Namadi, for helping co-authoring this work. It's been done without you. So, anyways, as you the importance of this doesn't need a lot of discussion here. Can everyone hear me if I step away? Yeah. So we see this idea of water prices increasing and income decreasing. So kind of the statistic that we see for water prices increasing is from 2007 to 2015, water prices have gone up on average in California around 45%. At the same time, income, especially for lower income households, has been stagnant or has decreased. So since 2017, median household income has gone down by about 6%. Now, if you think about the confluence of those two strategies, one way to think about it is to think about what we call discretionary income. So discretionary income is after-tax income, so disposable income, less water costs, because we're going to focus on water today, and less the cost for other essential needs. And so as discretionary income gets to zero, and if it goes below zero, that means households actually have to make trade-offs for essential needs. That's an awful situation to be in. So we want to kind of understand what role does water play relative to other expenditures in taking discretionary income down towards zero, and what we can do about it. This is obviously concerning for over 13 million low-income households. Now, low income is defined as households that make less than 200% of the federal poverty level, which is around $50,000, $49,000 per year. So this issue of affordability, what does it mean? Affordability is kind of a slippery term. There's a number of definitions that are given out there. Today we'll kind of think about two, all right? So EPA, in terms of discussing affordability, uses this threshold of 2 and 4.5%. So they suggest if your system water costs are greater than 2% of the median household income, that kind of raises the red flag in terms of water being affordable or not. Or if it's 4.5% of water and sewer costs, that raises the red flag in terms of water and sewage costs being affordable. Now that was originally done for the system level to morph in kind of to be used at the household level. The UN actually also defines kind of an affordability statistic. And rather than 2.5 and 2 and 4.5, they say 3 and 5%. But that's at the household level. So if the amount you spend on water and sewer services is greater than 5%, that raises the red flag, and I'd say that's a concern in terms of affordability. So with that those definitions in mind, the objectives of today's talk and this research was first, we kind of think about the first topic is a magnitude issue. What's the magnitude of the problem? So what we do is we want to evaluate how expenditures on water and sewer services within Eastern Municipal District service area compare with income that residents have to spend. So that's what's the magnitude of the issue within Eastern. We want to highlight how water affordability measures are influenced by what sort of water services are being discussed and what kind of income is being used. Turns out it's not as simple issue as initially as I thought. And this is kind of the measurement issue. So we have the magnitude issue, we've got the measurement issue, and And the third issue is illustrate how expenditures on water compare to expenditures on other essential needs that households confront. So to economists, it's often prices that don't matter, it's relative prices. So what do I do if I can't buy something, and what's the opportunity cost in terms of the price of the other good? So the same here is, what are the costs of the other essential services and how they relate to water? Because I need all that information to make the most effective policy to improve the well-being of California. And that gets at the last kind of point here. I want to reflect on our definition of discretionary income and ask, what role do changing water costs play in increasing well-being among low-income Californians? Now, to do this, we come up with what we call the water expenditure ratio. So rather than kind of call it a water affordability ratio, again, affordability is a slippery term, a water expenditure ratio is what we do. And water expenditure ratio is that we think about household I, any household. We want to estimate the amount of money they spend on water services. So for today, that will be water and sewer services, relative to the amount of money they have to spend overall. So here's this quotient. The WER is the household expenditures on water services over household income, multiplied by 100, and put it in percentage terms. Now, two questions arise when I think about this quotient. First is, what sort of water services do we want to consider? And second is, what sort of income do we want to use? And what can we reasonably measure? So let's focus on the first issue first. What sort of water services do we want to discuss? So you can think about, so what goes in the numerator? We can think about basic needs water, so water for drinking, cleaning, cooking, hygiene. And there's a lot of discussions about what that number is. There's no right answer here, right? But in terms of, if you look in the literature, there is kind of this, a little bit of rallying around 35.66 gallons per capita per day. This is actually double the amount Blake suggested in '96. But this is the number that we're going to use today in terms of a human right to water. It's actually close to the 6 cubic 100 feet per household that's specified by OEM. So we're going to use that as kind of our basic water needs. You can also think of indoor water use. So the state recently defined efficient indoor water use as around 55 gallons per capita per day. If you read the letter that Aqua sent to the state back in 2018, they also suggest 55 gallons per capita per day as kind of this human right to water, efficient indoor water use that they think maybe should be considered. It's also close to Teodoro's number of 50 that he uses in a new publication, which is widely circulated among people in this area. You can also think about a wintertime water use. So often if you can't measure indoor water use, you use wintertime, and it will show us wintertime actually is quite a bit above, you'll see, efficient indoor water use. You can also think about the full water budget. Now this isn't necessarily human right to water, but it's interesting to say if people actually hit their full water budget, right, in terms of efficient indoor and outdoor use, what does that mean for their overall water expenditures? And then finally, what do we actually observe in terms of people's choices regarding water use for different income levels? So for the lowest income levels, for the highest income levels, how does that quotient vary across those numbers? So you multiply those numbers by the relative water prices, adding some sewer costs and other capital fees, etc., and you get your numerator. And again, it includes sewer services. So now on to question 2. What sort of income do we use? So it's difficult to get individual household level data at that type of income. It's a really challenging thing. A lot of people know, they don't want to give it to you. It takes really time intensive. So what we often do is people use median household income for an area. An area is often the state, county, the city level, the agency level. And for Eastern, that level is around 68,000 is the median household income. But then you have to ask yourself, is that really, it's supposed to be representative of people in the region? How representative is 68,000 for all the households in Eastern? And so if you break up Eastern by census tract group, what you see is that, so there's 240 census tracts within Eastern Municipal Water District. You see that the median household income within each of those tracts varies from 22,000 up to 119,000. So for those households in the 22,000 tract, 68,000 isn't a very representative number. And so kind of an argument today is we have to get the measurements right to understand what the challenges households confront. And that's what we do. We can do this with household level data, which again, we're fortunate that Eastern provided it to us. And finally, you might want to think about, well, how well does the median household income across tract groups reflect low-income households? And in that sense, we're going to use this idea of 20th percentile income level as a measure of low-income households. And we're going to see how well or how much does defining or looking at your water expenditure ratios based on that 20th percentile income influence that quotient and measures of affordability. To give you an idea of how the median household income varies across Eastern Municipal Water District, here's all 240 tracts. They're color-coded by the median household income by tract. And so you can see the lowest incomes are the reds, with less than $38,000 per year for median household income. The highest are the dark blues. And what stands out there is there's a lot of heterogeneity or variability within the district, and 68,000 isn't probably a very good number for a lot of those households. So to do this research then, we have 8 years of household level data, single-family residential customers. So keep in mind, we do not have multifamily units and customers from multifamily units. And that's an oversight to some extent in terms of the conclusions we can draw. But we do have 138,000 single-family residential households. But we want to, at some point, think about how do we tackle the multifamily unit issue. We have total indoor, outdoor, and excessive water consumption. So we have indoor, outdoor budgets. We have landscape and household size. We have their rate structure, water tiered-based rates. We have their monthly sewer costs, other fees, capital improvement fees, etc. And median household by census tract group. Again, it's unique household level data, which is really important to our research here and get at the granularity of this issue. And to some extent, what we see here in this first graph is we see monthly water usage in CCS, cubic 100 feet, a cubic 100 foot is around 748 gallons. And we have the different income categories down here, 0 to 20% income lowest, up to the highest, 80 to the 100% income range. And what you see is that, as you kind of expect, is that water use goes up with income. Right? That's nothing surprising there. But what's important to realize is that if you look at the lower water use, there's a bunch of lower water use households with the high income that actually have lower water use than the low income. This is important when you think about rate structures and how you're going to deal with affordability based on water use. There's high income households that actually have low water use. So when you think about an affordability measure or a rate structure, you don't necessarily want to target low water use alone because they're bought up to deal with affordability, because there's high income households in that low water use category. Something to keep in mind. So to give you an idea of what's going on in Eastern's district, so here's the water costs in Eastern over those 8 years. So what's been happening in Eastern? Here's kind of a snapshot from 2011 to 2018. There's a lot of numbers there. I don't expect you to look at all that. You can look at the report, which is online at Eastern Municipal Water District's website. But kind of the point is that these are all in 2011 dollars. Is to look at kind of this red line here and the blue line at the bottom. So the columns, 2001 to 2017, is the first column is basic water needs. So what's the monthly cost to a household to meet that 35.66 gallons per house capita per month, or per day? And so we see that in 2018 is around $10.04. Right, to meet that human right to water. Overall, it's increased by $3.82 in 2011, which is about a 61% increase. So here's another thing that you have to be careful with is increases. 61% seems extremely large. $3, it depends on the household. To some people, $3 can be a lot. To others, it's maybe not so much. But these are the objective numbers here to consider. As we move from left to right, we see how, if you think about an indoor water budget, how has that changed over time? In 2018, it was around $17. In 2012, it was $22. That's actually gone down based on their rate structure. And if you go all the way to the right, so we have within budget cost, sewer costs. So sewer costs over that 8-year period have increased in real terms by $4, about an 18% increase. Overall water use costs have increased by $2.35 in real terms since 2011, which is about a 5.4% increase in 2011. The last column talks about average water use. What's happened to average water use? And we've seen that over that 8-year period, it's actually gone down by 1.87 on average cubic 100 feet per month. So it's important to keep in mind that water costs are both a function of prices and the amount you use. Right? And I have to hats off to a lot of the agencies for engaging in efficiency measures, right? Non-price conservation measures, high efficiency toilets, low flow shower heads, etc. Encouraging turf rebates, because that brings down that numerator, at least for everything above the essential cost, right? For instance, we're not for water costs. So what about inflation. How are these numbers compared to inflation and prices? So we see that from 2011 to 2018, basically inflation went up by average inflation rate went up by about 14%. If you had a household that fixed its level of water use in 2011, so think about a representative household, 3,000 square feet landscape, 3 household members, and they used the same amount of water in 2011, 2018, their costs went up by $6.17, or about 19%, outpacing inflation there. But that's holding water fixed, water use fixed. And then the last column talks about the percent budget. So, the state and a lot of agencies have these allocation-based rates. We have efficient indoor and outdoor use. So in 2011, 80% of their households were within their efficient budget, indoor and outdoor use. In 2018, 87%. So what you see is during the drought with all the state mandate and all the messaging, etc., you see an increase in the number of people in budget. People are reducing their water use, and then there's a little bit of backsliding. So overall, 1.2% increase annually. All right, on to this quotient now. So what does this affordability ratio or this expenditure ratio look like? So again, from 2011 to 2018, this is for around 130,000 households. And we see that if you look at just the 2018, if you look at the water expenditure ratio for 2018, it's 1.1%. So 1% of your income. Now this is income before taxes. Is 1.1%. If you look at indoor water and sewer, it's 1.129. For a full budget, so if someone's operating at their full water budget, what's their expenditure ratio? About 2. And then if you look at what did they actually observe on average in 2018, it's 1.58. So you see that on average, people are using less than their, system-wide, less than their efficient budget on average. So you see, and how they've changed. So in terms of the basic water use went from 0.85 to 0.11. So that's using median household income as the denominator at the tract level. What about if we use the 20th percentile income? How do these ratios, so for the low-income households, what do these ratios look like? So here we put it in a graphical form. And so the bottom graph is for basic water needs, the orange. So we see that the water expenditure ratio around 2011 was slightly above 1, and it goes up to 2018 slightly below 1.5. And then above that you have indoor water and sewer, so that's around 55 gallons per capita per day. You have average indoor water use, so I talked about this before. Indoor water use is certainly more than the 55 gallons per capita per day, and that's measured by winter water use. We have, if they are at their full budget, if they're at their full budget, that's the blue. And finally, what did they actually use? What's the expenditure ratio associated with what they actually used over time? So we generally see an increase. And the range is then from, in 2018, from, slightly up below 1.5 and up to slightly over 2 for actual water use. Another way to think about this is to look at every household in our sample. Right? So here we have actually, the dot is every household in our sample in 2018, their water expenditure ratio. And it's delineated by income category. And so there's basically, for the basic needs measure, we're looking at around 36 gallons per capita per day. And you see on average, you get a water expenditure ratio of slightly over 1%. And if you think about that affordability ratio the EPA designated of 4.5, how many households would be above that ratio? And in this case, 5 households are above that ratio. Now what's really potentially valuable here is we can identify the households now. And we can look if there's clustering in neighborhoods and such. So this could be a really useful tool to say, listen, these households have, compared to the average, a high, water expenditure ratio. Let's see what's going on there. Let's see if they're adopting these efficiency measures to lower their overall water use. So that's one way this data and these tools can be useful. So it's around 0.04% of the people of the households are above that. And we see that, generally speaking, it decreases with income. Okay, so lower income households have higher arrears, water expenditure ratio is higher, income have lower. But not always. And then what we do is we kind of just look at the other measures. So we look at the top graph is, the dots is for efficient indoor use. So at 55 gallons per capita per day, we have 69 households, 0.05% that go above that 4% level. right, at the 4.5% level. Again, it helps us identify who are these households, where are they at, is there a way that we can develop a program to help them lower their water bills and make water more affordable. And then we look at winter water usage, so there's 788 households that would be above that mythical 4.5 level for, if you just look at average over December, January, and February. And then this is just another way to present it. These box plot graphs are just another way to present the same data in more concentrated format. And then here's overall. So if you think, let's just take what they did, what they used in 2018, and we see that in overall actual usage, we had 550 households that went above the 4.5 level, about 0.4% of their overall ratepayers, single-family residential houses. And if you just look at the budget base, if everyone said, let's follow this rule of efficient indoor and outdoor use, you'd have about 4,000 households that went above that ratio. Okay. Again, it's certainly positively related with income in terms of overall usage. So now that's kind of the magnitude of the issue. Now I'd like to talk about kind of what's the magnitude of these other essential services and how does water relate to it? What role does water play? So here we collected expenditure ratios essentially and the fraction of income spent on other essential services from 2001 to 2017. For food, housing, transportation, and healthcare, we use the averages for the metropolitan statistical area for LA, Orange County, and Riverside. So it's not perfectly representative of Eastern. It's a little bit larger area. And if you look at the numbers in 2017, we see that on average for food, income on food, they spend about 32% of their income on housing, around 13% of their income on transportation, and 5% of their income on healthcare. Then we have these other categories that weren't as that we couldn't get in that metropolitan statistical area data set. So this is average over a region. The region includes a bunch of states in the Southwest. And so electricity is around 1.5%. So that's very similar to if you look at the last column. Here's Eastern in 2017. Basically, on average, households spent 1.48% of their income on water and sewer services, which is very similar to the 1.48% of electricity. And this table 3 just kind of summarizes all that data for 2017. So you get an idea of the relative magnitudes of these essential services as a fraction of income. So some key takeaways from this set. Water needs rose from 0.85 to 1.1% of median household income, and using that very granular measure of median household income. Can be significantly impacted by your choice of income measure and very inversely with income. So if you look at the district level, median household income, which a lot of people might do, you get a water expenditure ratio of 0.91. If you look at the tract level, you get 1 percentile median household income. Percentile income, you get about 1.5. So it becomes very significant to determine what your denominator income measure may use is. Are significantly lower than USDA's thresholds or the UN thresholds for water and sewer services. Remember, these are numbers on average. These are still aggregates and numbers on average. So there are still, this isn't saying households aren't wrestling with this issue. Right? These are averages, and we know the problems with averages, right? A snake and a millipede on average have 100 legs or something like that. But they give you a sense. They're one way to summarize information. Right? And this is why we also provide a lot of that other data to give you an idea of the extent of the problem for other households. And they can provide than other essential services. So we certainly don't want to take our eyes off housing issue with affordability. Right? That is obviously the #1 issue. And transportation, food, and healthcare all are much more significant than water. They're all essential services in the L-shaped affordable California. So kind of the conclusions, water is a local issue. This is just one study, it's one data point. And we can draw any kind of line from one data point or not. So you want to see how the rest of the region is doing in a similar manner, I think. With household level data, we get much more precise information and estimates. We've already seen if you use these accurate numbers, you really get a full representation of what the problem is, and you can identify if there's some clustering in households that are really having a hard time, potentially having a hard time making it. The income measures matter, so measurement matters. So we're talking about the same numbers. I illustrated how different median household incomes matter, but for low-income households, there may be pictures received. So even the income measure I use is imperfect. Right? I use the income measure given from the U.S. Census, so it's not after-tax income. Right? It doesn't count for other services or still a rough estimate, and we can do better on that as well. And finally, to have substantive impact on societal well-being, why consider the full range of essential services and consider where change can have appreciable effects. This calls, again, similar to water policy, as Joaquin knows, and advocates. It calls for a portfolio approach. When you're dealing with household and livelihoods, you have to look at all the potential policy levers to come up with the most effective and equitable policies there. You also want to understand no kind of prioritization and the magnitudes of different problems, so you know where you should spend an extra dollar, extra hour of effort. And at that point, thank you.
Who's coming to us from the UST's Price School of Public Policy, and she's an assistant research professor there, as well as affiliated with the Price Center for Social Innovation Research. Come on up, Donna.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so privileged to be here today. I'm also a graduate of Berkeley, so it's so great to be back in the seat. I always feel like coming home. And so excited to be sharing some newer work that we've been working on at the Price Center for Social Innovation. And we're really hoping to add to the conversation, a very important conversation that we're having around housing affordability in a really broad sense, really speaking to your conversation. And so I'm really excited by these today. And I want to say that I'm working on this project with Sean Angster, who I'm moving PhD candidates in the Price School, and Gary Pager, who's director of the Price Center for Social Innovation. So here, I'm really thinking about affordability in terms of rent burden. And this is a really common measure of affordability if you're familiar with it. You're considered rent burden if you pay over 30% of your income on rent. And it's considered a really important threshold after which you begin to make the sort of trade-offs that our previous speaker was talking about, right? And it's a really nice measure because it captures both the cost of your housing as well as the amount that you're making. So we really like that different dimension. We have very high rates of rent burden across the LA region, but in eastern Riverside County, that looks really different than it does in downtown Los Angeles, right? Because the driver is different, whether it's high rents versus very low income. We're thinking about this measure in a very broad sense, but there are other factors here, thinking really about household size being an important factor, as well as location and housing costs. And so really a lot of the research that I'll talk about has focused on, well, what do people go without? And it's a very important question. We're really interested in color coping in a much broader sense as well, because we know that this phenomenon, as people pay more of their income on rent, that at a certain point in time they have to leave. They have to leave, right? And that this is contributing to homelessness, which is a growing problem across our region. So really understanding, in a very cumulative sense, what's happening here, right? How does this relate to eviction? How does this relate to homelessness? A lot of the issues that we're dealing with. And today I'm really going to be focusing, well, how are people trying to spend, right? And it's a deeply important question, and the impacts are really significant. So just briefly to show you what's happening here in Los Angeles. And this is across the LA metro area, that we have a very high price to income ratio. Housing costs are very high relative to incomes. And for this reason, we have a very low proportion of home ownership. So when we talk about renters, we're talking about most people. Very important. And for most renters, people are facing rent burden. Again, this threshold after which they're starting to make trade-offs. And about 1 in 3 across the LA region, from the greater Southern California region, from Ventura to the border, about 1 in 3 renter households are severely rent burdened. They're paying over 50% of their income on rent. A very high ratio, right? And what we see in the most recent study from the Joint Center for Housing Studies that Harvard just released very recently, which is so exciting, we have new data, that we're starting to see growing impacts on middle-income households, right? That they're starting to pay a greater share of their income on rent, and it's starting to hit higher-income households too. This isn't to say that the impacts aren't there for low-income households, but that they're already paying a significant amount of their income and rent, right? So thinking about this very broadly is an issue that cuts across a lot of our rental population. Now it's a big issue that cuts across these populations, and it's a growing issue because we're starting to lose low-income units faster then people are either leaving the region or starting to earn more money, right? And so we're starting to have a real housing shortage at these very low-income units, and this is across the LA region, right? Anywhere from 1 in 5 to 2 in 5, or anywhere from 20 to 40% of low-income units we've lost in from 2011 to 2017, the low-income renters. And when we're trying to think about how we deal with this issue, it's really complicated and it's hard, right? And I'm sure I'm speaking to the crowd when I say that it's difficult to build, it's difficult to think about how we solve our social issues in California and particularly in a complex LA context, right? And part of this has to do in housing specifically that land costs have skyrocketed, right? And that we have this challenge of actually building the affordable needed support. So I give you all these data as a context to show you that it's a significant issue, it's a growing issue, and it's a really important issue for low-income renters. And this was really the motivation of our project, right? At the Price Center for Social Innovation, we're focused on finding new strategies and new tools to help solve our complex social issues. And one of our main pieces of work is around housing affordability. And this really emerged because we were doing research with a few different communities across the LA region. So here at the top, the 2 Los Angeles Promise Zones. In the Coachella Valley, a collective impact organization, and then in San Diego, a neighborhood called City Heights, which is a very diverse immigrant context. She'll be talking a lot about today because it has a lot of interesting lessons that it can teach us, I think. And so we were working with these community partners, and we saw that everyone was starting to organize around housing affordability. They just couldn't get away from it, even if it wasn't their central goal. Even if we're thinking about water, we have to think about housing affordability. Even if we're thinking about criminal justice, we have to think about housing affordability. And so we saw a really interesting opportunity to add to the conversation and think about, well, how are people coping, right? And so we've conducted a large project over the past 2 years, and I'll be presenting some preliminary findings from our focus groups, really thinking about what have we learned so far. So we conducted 36 focus groups with about 400 people and a large board of our survey. We talked to, for over 45 minutes, over 1,000 people across the LA region. Conducting focus groups in different areas to really understand how geography might play a role, how difference in communities plays a role, and really thinking about how are people coping, really is a prerequisite to ensuring that their voices are in the conversation in a very fundamental way. The goal here, which is why I so appreciate this audience, is to think about what can we do. So thinking about it from the academic literature, so what do we know? Well, a lot of our research, as I said, is really focused on these high-level studies using administrative data, thinking about what are the trade-offs people are making. And what I'm going to tell you makes a lot of sense, right? As people pay more of their income on rent and their incomes are stagnant, they start reducing spending in other categories. And cutting back to the bare basics, right? So they face energy insecurity, they live in lower quality housing, they double up, right? Who doesn't live with a roommate? And then they reduce their spending in food, and you start getting into really serious health impacts. And there's been some work that's shown that overcrowding in particular is associated with a lot of negative health and other outcomes, particularly for youth, right? But beyond what people are consuming less of, because this is a somewhat obvious point, right? We know from important work like Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. This is a really important study to show us really how housing systems contribute to vulnerability, right? And how housing exploitation and poverty are deeply related, and it particularly impacts low-income populations, right? And so thinking about the way in which housing can be a source of vulnerability, housing instability, right? And this is a deeply important point, but Matthew Desmond is talking about a very specific context, evictions, in a very specific setting, which is Milwaukee and Rust Belt cities. And so thinking about it in the LA context, we know that people move for a lot of reasons. We know that they're impacted beyond facing a formal eviction. And we know, and we should expect, that it's different here in Los Angeles in fundamental ways and it's different in Milwaukee. So we really need to understand what's happening as a prerequisite, as I said, to helping support people through this. And so not to dwell too much on the academic work, but we should expect differences across groups, and sociology teaches this, right? That people depend on each other for social support, and this differs across immigrant and non-immigrant groups, across speaks of color versus white populations across age, across a lot of different characteristics. And in particular, a real focus in our study on immigrant populations because they face disproportionate barriers to institutional access, right? And that this is a structural issue, but it should change the amount of support and the way in which they seek support. And there's been plenty of research in sociology that's shown that. So to summarize the context, right? We know that housing affordability matters. And we know that we should expect differences across groups, but we don't really understand how that works. And so our study really enters here and is really attempting to contribute to that conversation. Knowing that this is really important. Here in Los Angeles, in City Heights in particular, there's a very strong refugee population and a network of support that's really existed since the Vietnam War when they started receiving large refugee populations. There's a lot of infrastructure here to support diverse populations. And that's a good thing, right? And historically, the LA region is really built on diverse populations, and this is a source of strength in so many ways, and not just economically, but also socially, right? And so thinking about, okay, if this is starting to change, what are the short and long-term impacts of this, and how do we support people to stay in socially supportive contexts? So I can't give a talk without showing you the research questions. So here are our basic research questions, really thinking about what are the implications here across different groups, families, communities, beyond the household level, right? We know that people exist in these broader social support networks, and then differences across groups and populations. And I could talk to you about this more, but I really just want to say here that we worked with community organizations to ask questions that were deeply important to them, we hope, and structured our protocol accordingly. So really focusing on these drivers of rent burden and trade-offs that they're making, the social support questions, but moving to what are people's goals for the future, right? And thinking about how we can create and enact those visions together of an inclusive Los Angeles region and Southern California region. So I want to briefly walk you through what we found in the story that I'm telling you today. And then I'm going to use residents' own quotes and words to really illustrate these points. First, and I think this really speaks to the previous presentation, which I really appreciated, people are making these really significant and impactful consumption trade-offs. We know this. People said this repeatedly. They have gone without everything that they thought they could go without. And they felt that this was getting worse, that it was just getting harder and harder to make ends meet. And one person in City Heights said, you just have to reduce everything you can to pay rent. Rent was the central point of stability, right? That their housing was so critical to them that they were going without anything else that they could. Some youth talking about how they only ate one meal a day for years, right? Their families. So everything that they could cut back on, they already had. And as we would expect from our sociology friends, people are relying on each other for basic support for their lives, but also related to housing stability precisely. So finding out about new places to live, thinking about the different opportunities for subsidies, learning about information in ways that they're finding from their friends and their neighbors, in ways that directly helps them. And also turning to each other when possible. What we heard over and over again was that they didn't feel like they had anyone to go to for any of these issues. Sorry, I guess I spent a lot of time talking. So I'm just going to review a lot of these issues. We're used to having like hour-long talks, so I'll just briefly go through it. But these things are spatially rooted, right? Riverside is a special place for people. These aren't, all places are not equal. And so we really need to think about when people are removed from their context, what that matters for them, right? People want to stay for a reason. And however, so they're trying to stay, but this lack of affordability is really creating a lot of exploitation, right? And leaving people in these contexts where they don't feel like they have any other place to move. Oh, thank you. I have 10 minutes now. So to get back on track, people really want to stay. And this makes sense, right? And that communities are important to people, that infrastructure matters, right? That having religious institutions, cultural institutions, this is a source of strength in our communities, right? But without anywhere else to go, the idea that I might not find another home that's affordable means that people had very few options. And this left them in very precarious and often situations of extreme exploitation. Really deeply, deeply harmful stories that we heard. Things that were often illegal, and people said, it might be illegal, but what am I going to do? I'm going to go to someone and then I'm going to get kicked out of my home anyways, right? And so thinking about what that means. And so this final academic point, really, but thinking about how we're measuring these phenomena, looking at displacement, looking at measures like rent burden, we're missing a lot of the story. We really need to think about how our families are coping, how our communities are coping, and how do we start thinking about housing supply and new construction from a place that we're protecting our communities. So just briefly want to walk you through some of the findings. Again, thinking about the social support here, that this is inherently spatial. People were going to each other for childcare, linguistic services, information about employment, for emotional support, school tutoring, and particularly these linguistic opportunities in places like City Heights, where if you're Burmese and you're not literate, and you have to go to someone for basic document translation, how it's impossible to find those resources in other regions. It just might not be possible. So thinking about it through that context can show you an extreme example of why you want to stay so desperately in City Heights, right? And so inherently this is spatial, right? It's tied to particular places. And yet people are saying, even though support is so important, that it's narrowing. And it's narrowing because people can't go to church, they're working too much. That other people have less, right? And that transportation costs are really extreme. And so when you're cutting back, what it means to not be able to afford gas, okay? And as one person said, we don't get to spend personal time with each other because we're so focused on this one thing, right? Because if we don't have it, we can't live in this house, right? And so within this context, though, people have fewer options for leaving. They feel that they have nowhere else to go. And when asking people, okay, so where would you go if you left LA, the Coachella Valley, City Heights, people said they didn't know. They might move somewhere really far away, like Ohio, if they had family. But for other people, they said if they didn't have those relatives, that they were just worried about becoming homeless, right? And this fear of displacement was so pervasive. And so people were attempting a lot of micro moves to stay. They knew sometimes 3 moves out where they were going to live, who they could crash with, right, in order to stay in place. And with just such limited affordable housing, people were stuck in these really discriminatory and often predatory situations. This is true even for voucher holders. So one person said that the house we live in is very, very small. We asked for maintenance. They told us to pay out of our own pocket. We cannot. We rented the house as it is without any maintenance. It wasn't even fixed. It used to be $1,440, $1,450. Now it's $1,500. They told us if you don't want it, just move out. Very similar statement that we heard over and over again, right? Is when you need things and you tell them to repair, they'll tell you just move out. We can find someone really easily to replace you. Okay, so where are you going to go if there's nowhere else you can afford? So you're really stuck in place. Maybe we're not informed of our rights, but the landlords scare you, and it's happening a lot. The problem here is that there are many people who want to rent. It's very difficult to find. And this, again, led people to be stuck in these situations that you can really understand how this is such a harmful situation. So just to provide one example, someone said, I'm living on the 2nd floor and I have to gather my kids at 8 p.m. in just one room so they won't disturb the neighbors because the neighbors downstairs are hit our floor with a stick whenever our kids make noise, right? And so thinking about this, what if they complain to the landlord and you get kicked out? Or if your lease isn't renewed? Thinking about, it doesn't have to be a formal eviction, right? It's just about how these situations you're just trying to lay low, not letting your kids play in the park. And these are things that we know are really valuable for kids, for families. And throughout just this fear that what's happening, the good investment that's happening is not for them. And that this is no longer a place for diverse populations. And so and this is a picture of City Heights, one of the newer developments. Many houses started to sell, and those living them are mainly white people, which before you didn't see. Again, about 40% of people in City Heights are immigrants. And it's a very diverse populations. And I've lived here for many years. We notice this when we get worried. Maybe they want to kick us out of that area and make it a little bit different. So throughout this context, really thinking about what are the implications if a place like City Heights, if a place like LA isn't able to allow new immigrants to communities where we know that they have a lot more social support and networks to thrive, right? So I want to just conclude with some key takeaways here. We've always known that poverty is stressful, right? But high rents are introducing new stressors, and they're extending housing instability and housing insecurity. And so thinking about this tension between this growing unaffordability, but the need to stay, the desire to stay in communities and places, really narrows people's options and leaves them in harmful conditions and drives their stress. Again and again, we heard, I don't know what I'm going to do in the future. I don't know where I would go. And thinking about affordability is not just about displacement, but how people are coping, how they're strategizing to stay in ways that are creating these short and long-term impacts that are just deeply obvious, right? Thinking about health when people say that I want to afford good food, I know I should be eating healthier, but I just can't, right? I can't even afford to be able to go to the store. And that this really differs across groups. And thinking about it, displacement is a problem for anyone. But for immigrant communities, for communities that rely on, communities of color that rely on very specialized services, religious institutions, cultural institutions, thinking about the Crenshaw area of Los Angeles, which is highly gentrifying, that it has these really amazing and important stores, black hair care salons, right? That this is really a source of strength in the LA region. But as the neighborhoods are changing, race is a fundamental part of that, race and ethnicity. And so thinking about how this growing phenomenon of rent burden and affordability is really changing the landscape of opportunity for low-income renters to be able to move, to be in really healthy situations, and to be able to turn to people for financial and other support, right? And thinking about how these even vouchers, traditional forms of state support, aren't going as far. They're not providing that stability. And so a real concern from our study about how immigrants are able to come, live, and stay in urban regions and keep LA as a very diverse and a source of real opportunity amidst the just real challenge of paying rent month to month. I want to make sure that we talk about what we can do about it because we can solve a lot of our problems. And I think that's a really important point. Thinking about rental and tenant protections are a key component of this. People have the ability to seek resources, and this means enforcement too, right? Allowing people to actually access the laws that are in the books and then creating new laws and social supports to ensure that they're not trapped in these situations is really important. So how do we help people access those key sources of support? And knowing that policies can matter very little if we don't enforce them. Secondly, we have to build more, but we have to do it in a way that protects our existing communities and really engages them in the future visioning of what the broader Southern California region looks like in the future. And just remaining that we're really sensitive to difference in community, but engaging them as a real key stakeholder. And thinking also about community building and family support. The real concerns about what the kids were saying about these lack of connections to their parents. I didn't really get a chance to get into it, but kids were telling us, I love my parents, I respect my parents, but I don't know my parents anymore. They're working so much. So how do we support our families, right? And how do we support our communities in ways that extend beyond housing, but really meet their needs? So I conclude by saying our researches are done. We just wrapped up data collection for a survey across LA. So stay tuned. It's in late spring. I hope we're going to be releasing some of that data. We knocked on or tried to access 12,000. We talked to 800 people and did a really extensive survey. And our goal here is really just to make sure that whenever we think about what we can do about it, that we're coming from a place of deep understanding. So if any of you have ideas for us about how we can make this work as impactful as possible, and keep that conversation going, I'm absolutely open to that. And just really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work here with you today. Thank you so much.
Now I'm going to invite all our panelists to come up and have a seat here, and I'll introduce each of you. Come on up. Okay. All right. So I'll start to introduce our colleagues. So we already heard from Professor Schwabe and Dr. Rosen and really appreciate their comments and thought those were very insightful presentations. We're also extraordinarily fortunate to have a really interesting group of people that are to speak to these issues today, and I really thank my colleague Justine Ross, the Associate Director, for organizing this event. So on the panel here we have Carlos Gonzalez, who's the Chief of Staff to Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia, who represents the 56th Assembly District here in California. We also have Sayori Baldwin, who's the Director of the Department of Public and Social Services here in Riverside County. Okay. We have also finally Adnan Ortega, who's the Principal of Ortega Strategy Group and the Executive Director of the California Association of Mutual Water Companies. And so what I'd like to do is first give those that have not yet spoken, beyond Professor Schwabi and Professor Rosen, just a moment if you'd like to raise 1 minute's worth of reaction or comments or any particularly important issue. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open it up to the audience, and I'll collect questions. I'll do my best. And we have traveling microphones, I believe, in the audience. And I would like to say it would be helpful to orient this to this broader question. You know, really, we have limited resources to help low-income families. What programs and policies really offer the greatest return on investment? You know, how do we increase affordability? What's going to make the policy interventions that have the biggest bang for the buck, if you will? So first I'll see if any of my colleagues here on the panel would like to say anything. By no means are you obligated to do so, but there's an issue you wanted to raise and introduce to the discussion. Anyone? Okay. Are we good?
I'll try to keep it short, but I
Okay.
can probably speak a lot.
Push the button to make it green.
First of all, thank you for the invite. I am so passionate about this subject, and so when I think about the overall dynamics of homelessness and poverty, the first thing I think about is just individuals who grow up in poverty, and the statistics are overwhelming. We know that children who grow up in poverty, they're 5 times more likely to drop out of high school, and they're 13 times more likely not to graduate from high school. And so if you look at the interplay of housing, affordable housing, we have to start with what is the trajectory of our children. And looking at the jobs in Riverside in terms of earning a livable, sustainable wage, I think every one of us is probably 1 paycheck short of being homeless. And so if we look at our individuals who earn $10 an hour at our minimum wage jobs that we need in order to keep this economy afloat, to me it's just the basic math of $1,600 a month and don't have a crisis. You're not going to be able to pay your rent. And so what policies do we put in place? And as the Department of Social Services, I'm very appreciative of the statistics in terms of medical. In terms of our Medi-Cal benefits, we serve about 353,000 individuals in Riverside County. If you look at our CalFresh benefits, about 100,000 individuals. And to me, these are supplements in order to lift individuals out of poverty. And then when we look at our CalWorks program, we serve about 20,000 individuals. And then my last point, when we talk about homelessness, we have to look at our aging population on fixed incomes. To me, that really is where the crisis is brewing. Individuals should not, when they get a certain age, have to make the choice of, am I going to pay for some medicine that's not covered by my health insurance? My car broke down, how do I handle this crisis? Or do I pay my rent? These folks just aren't surviving with a fixed income.
So, good morning. Yes, woke up way too early for this. I just moved to Sacramento this morning. So, good morning, right? So, really fast, I think from our perspective, and Carlos Gonzalez, Chief of Staff for Eduardo Garcia, member out of the 6th District, we bring a different perspective as a principal, right? We are from the Coachella Valley, Imperial County, very rural, conversation, very rural district, right? And in our perspective, sort of like people, maybe some folks can afford water, but they can't drink it because it's pretty dirty, right? There is no infrastructure, and so we have, I think, a different identity, a different conversation in regards to what does that mean? But even more than that, right, and I was sort of tell the story, I grew up in a labor camp for most of my life. Before that, I grew up in a Polanco apartment. And so I grew up not being able to drink water because it was dirty. And to this moment, right, I actually live between Indio and Sacramento, but I have smud water, but every morning, I tend not to drink from it because in my head, I grew up thinking that whatever comes from there is dirty, right? So as we talk about affordability, I think it's also important to talk about educating our community that, and trust, and get into trust, some of the water agencies to say that what you guys are putting in there or they're delivering, it's actually safe and drinkable. Because someone like me, as I grew up, I'd rather go spend $2 in bottled water than actually open it to a sink and drinking it. And it's just in my psyche, in my head. So, and I guess we'll get into a little bit more into some policies that the member has put out together to make sure that there's safe, affordable, and drinking water around the state, and specifically in communities like the ones I grew up, disadvantaged, and for the most part with a lot of minorities, right? So, good to be here. By the way, just actually me and Joaquin went to high school and same high school together. We're like a year apart, right? So very good to see him, and very proud that someone from Latino high school in Chola Valley is in that position and understands sort of like what we talk about when we push policies in the state that deal with our communities. So thank you and good morning.
All right, great. Thank you very much, folks. Let's open it up to the audience and hear
I didn't see that. As I was very appreciative of UC Riverside, but in the opening remarks by Mr. Esquivel, because I think this issue of water affordability requires that we connect the dots. And what we've heard here is that affordability has building blocks. And those building blocks include aging infrastructure. When we talk about immigrant communities, I know when my family came to California, we moved to Boyle Heights because it was the most affordable place that we could live. And then we moved into unincorporated Los Angeles County where the infrastructure was old. And what we had to deal with in terms of our basic services were very different than what I enjoy today, living somewhere else. Our sources of water, where we get our water from and the quality of that water and what's happened above that water. In Southeast Los Angeles, for example, where you have a human right to water issue that's risen and has gotten the limelight from time to time, they're subject to a legacy of pollution that was referenced here. And the disadvantages that come, for example, in installing new infrastructure. Paul Jones and I worked at the Central Basin Municipal Water District, and if you looked at the cost of building recycled water lines to build more reliability in these communities, it was very expensive because of the legacy of soil contamination that doubles or triples the cost of building infrastructure. The other one is our cultural drivers. I think Mr. Gonzalez referenced that there's cultural drivers that are not limiting the impact on low-income people just from the cost of tap water. There's been studies that indicate that people that are in low-income brackets, particularly Latinos and other immigrants, we spend up to 60 times more for our drinking water because we won't use the tap water. So it's not just the cultural implication of not trusting the tap water, it's the cost that we bear of having to pay more. It's expensive to be poor because you're going to pay. I think the cost of bottled water, tap water is 600 times less expensive than bottled water. The fourth one is community standards, and that's a polite way of saying regulations. These regulations are in place to protect our health, but because we don't take advantage of economies of scale that already exist, it so happens that it's people in wealthier communities that get to enjoy water that meets these more stringent standards than the people in lower income communities. And it's our tax policies that are driving it. It's the Prop 218s and the Prop 13s that say that if I invest to help someone else, and I'm not deriving a direct benefit from it, that there's no general benefit to society, and some of us might disagree with that. And then I think ultimately it's public confidence. There's a lot of things that we can talk about that are affecting public confidence that then drives all these other choices that we're making. So So it's not just about people of modest means having things put upon them. These things that are put upon us also result in choices that we make that are making us spend more money on places.
And what I'll encourage people is to try to catch my eye, and I'll like tap you, and then I'll put you in a queue, okay?
I'll do my best.
Just make sure it's green. It's green. Gotcha.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'd like to start by thanking Chairman Esquivel for being here today. I spent about 40 years as a water litigator, 10 of those years representing your board in Northern California, 30 years representing, among others, the state water contractors, Metropolitan Water District, Frank water users, and others. And frankly, practicing out of Riverside, where we never saw people from the State Water Resources Control Board, particularly board members. Candidly, if you weren't from the Delta, it didn't seem like you mattered very much. And so it's a really nice change. I thank you for that. I think also, if you looked at some of the numbers that Dr. Rosen presented, and you looked at the cost of land, this is where the growth is going to be. This is where housing is going to happen. This is where people are going to move. And it's important that we do have water. We're at the tail end of the state water project down here, but we matter too. And thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the chairman. I have a question for Kurt. Kurt, I was wondering if perhaps in some ways you undercounted the impact of water pricing on the poor. We saw from the material that you presented that about 11% of the family budget is related to food costs. And we kind of saw that as food, but we didn't see it so much as water. But water is a huge factor in terms of the price of food. You don't grow food without water, and in California, most of that water comes from either the State Water Project or the Central Valley Project. So if we look at changes in pricing, isn't in fact the impact of water pricing greater on the poor than simply that 1.48% that we saw in a couple of your charts?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive point, Greg. And you kind of think about, I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but you know, we're focusing somewhat narrowly on household affordability with water that's piped into their house. To economists, we may think of a broader analysis, what we call more of a general equilibrium analysis versus a partial equilibrium analysis, where we start accounting for actually changed water prices or costs outside of the region. How does that translate into influencing not only the piped water that comes in, but also the input of water as it influences the cost of the other services that are essential to you. So yeah, in terms of if you're looking forward in terms of trying to do some predictions, you'd want to account for the change in water prices through not only drinking water, but also how it affects food prices. That's a very good point. Thank you.
The gentleman with the blue shirt there.
Hi, good morning. I have a question. I'm going to reach over and, for a framework, give you what I understand was happening in South Africa in Cape Town. There's a way of framing the question to you in the two studies that you presented. So in Cape Town, day zero was announced. And there was some widespread newspaper articles about the societal disruption that was occurring ahead of day zero. So big disruption, but no actual running out of water, just the perception of running out of water. So the question for the table is, these issues of affordability that are coming up, and then trying to assess a fixed number and saying that that number is what makes it unaffordable, is there perhaps a context in some of your studies that human perception, right, the trend or the erosion in affordability is really what becomes the trigger for some of the lower income households? Because it's their perception of what's coming that causes them to make changes or to feel stress or to increase their stress in other areas of their life.
And was involved a little with the government of South Africa at the time of Day Zero, when there was an initiative to try getting people to think more about what we had traditionally called toilet to tap and using reclaimed sources as a way to augment reliability. I think there is some relativity, if I'm understanding your comments correct, and we don't have to go all the way to Africa to see it. For example, there was a study in 2010 by Circle of Blue, and they found that cities in rain-scarce western regions of the United States have the lowest residential water rates and the highest level of water use as compared to regions in the East Coast. So the issue of affordability shifts a little bit, which is why I contend that the real costs are driven, yes, by the water bill, but it's also driven by the choices that you make as a result of all these building blocks that constitute affordability. So that whether you're on the East Coast or whether you're on the West Coast, the common denominator is that if you don't trust the water supply, or if the water's coming out brown, you're going to make more expensive choices. And so I think we do undercount the affordability issue in low-income communities, but I don't think it's necessarily driven just by what's happening at the tap. It's driven by the other choices that we're making when we want to consume water for our basic needs.
Oh, sorry, let's let Kurt respond.
So also, kind of, when I think about perceptions, I want to go back to what Don said about perceptions of drinking water quality. In areas where water quality is fine, and you see people's perceptions causing them to spend additional income on bottled water or transitioning to more sugary drinks, there are additional costs associated with that, which is why, a study by Rural Community Services District and perhaps Eastern looking at this issue would be very timely, and discussions about that. Perceptions also have to do with, the ability of ratepayers to allow their boards and their water managers to make efficient investments. I have poor perceptions about really what's happening to my water rates. And I'm kind of pounding the table and saying, now, this isn't for really low-income households, but the average household. And I'm saying rates are, went up by 60%, but that really translates into $2. I might vote against what's going to be a really cost-effective infrastructure project that in the long run is going to keep my rates lower than higher. So perceptions are important in that perspective. And going back to what Sayori brought up, and as well as Carlos, in terms of water quality, etc. All these things are linked. When I think of water, I think of water as a linked system, which Chairman Esquivel brought up. Right? What happens in one area has an impact on others. Social programs are linked as well. If I don't pay my water bill, and I have to have a truck roll coming out and they give me an additional charge, that's going to affect maybe my ability to pay for housing, which then affects the amount of money that the social programs go into housing that Giovanni brought up. So all these things are linked, which is great to be sitting among such a distinguished panel up here, as well as having the type of diversity out in the audience on these issues.
Who would you say the onus is really on to solve this problem of water affordability? For the water agencies themselves, they have to increase rates, and as you were just saying, the rates themselves aren't necessarily the issue. Is it the regulators? Is it the community organizations that are partnering with water agencies? Who is really going to provide the most answer to solve these issues?
I have some strong opinions about that. Well, first of all, if you look at the way that we have planned for water in California, principally since the 1990s when I became aware of it, we were coming up with integrated regional resource plans, urban water management plans. And if you look at the common denominator across those plans, we were saying that we were going to meet reliability objectives. And we've been wildly successful. In Southern California, for example, today, we have about over 3 million acre-feet of water in storage. That's equal to all of the groundwater and imported water demands in a year. Now, we're beginning to turn a page with the governor's resiliency plan. And I know that many people will look at resiliency as a slogan. Like we're just doing it to get people's attention. The real challenge is, will we make it a policy? And what does it mean when a water system is resilient? Would we say that a community where they have a lot of water in storage, for example, where nonetheless there's people that don't have safe drinking water, is resilient? I think our intuition tells us that resiliency is defined primarily by our weakest link. And so I think that as we flesh out the policies that go behind resiliency, we're going to have an opportunity in Southern California as we update our integrated resources plan in 2020. It could make it a priority in the way that reliability doesn't. And I'll give you an example. PFAS, there's a new response level for PFAS. There's a community in the metropolitan system, there's actually two, Pico Rivera and Montebello, that have levels that exceed the response level. So these utilities have to go tell their customers, hey, we're gonna have to either dramatically increase your water rates to build a treatment plant, or we're gonna continue serving the water that's, the response levels are not enforceable standards. The other solution is that they could connect to the metropolitan water system, except they don't have a connection, and the cost of that connection rivals the cost of the treatment plant. So what did reliability get to those people that through their property taxes and through their water bills paid for that system? So that's why I'm arguing that let's celebrate our victory for reliability, but we really need to start focusing on resiliency. And once we do that, I think we'll have greater opportunities for dealing with the affordability issue and the issue of disadvantaged communities in water.
So I would say from the state's perspective, last year actually we ran and we moved this safe and affordable drinking fund. It was SB 200, AB 217. Purpose at the end day for that is, that basically allows the state board to not just only pay for capital costs for water treatment in communities like ours, but it also makes sure that there's ongoing funds for O&M, right, operation maintenance. For our perspective, including our Polanco Parks, which is communities that I talked about that we lived in, it also makes it possible to expand water service to low-income communities. I think for us in the state, we're trying to make sure that at least those folks that can't afford and can't have safe drinking water, that there is a pot of money that ultimately can help them. Within that, we actually created within that bill, a task force on water and safe drinking water. It actually just met for the first time, I think last week or so. Their purpose is to make sure that there is ongoing DGRF funding right now, $100 billion a year, to invest in capital projects to make sure that folks can get those services. I think when we talk, at least in our perspective, of affordable water, in our area, it means a couple of different things. Not only doesn't only mean that it's lower cost, but it also means that there's got to be jobs around folks around there. We've got to create some infrastructure. We've got to make sure folks are moving, right? And in our area, in Imperial County, on a daily basis, 24% unemployment. On bad days, 32%, right? And so we got to create a system to where we're fixing, making it affordable, but we're also creating some infrastructure and some jobs locally. So then that can be more affordable, right? So a lot of folks starting to think, look, we should pay less, but if folks are not working, they can't even afford that either, right? And so we got to create this conversation and this movement all together, like Adan said, connecting those dots to make sure that we're all sort of like synchronized working together, right? So that's sort of like what we're trying to do out in the state. I know there's going to be a lot of conversation this year in regards to where the money can come. We are talking about a climate resiliency bond that actually the street propositions are now. The Senate has one, the governor has one, and then us in the Senate we're coming out one within the next couple of days. And it's all perspective of investing money and making sure that it goes to those parts that need it.
All right, the next question, we're going to go to one of our terrific public policy school students. Marissa, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. I'm Marissa. I'm a third-year public policy student here at UC Riverside. I am also the lead for the educational campaign for the UC Riverside Healthy Beverage Initiative. This is a system-wide initiative spearheaded by the UC Healthy Campus Network. The original push for this initiative is to deter students and the greater campus community away from sugary sweetened beverages. But also, I wanted to have like more of a discussion about just like increasing water accessibility, which is a part of it. But I think it's just something really important to discuss, especially here in the Inland Empire, as we have like.
Are already thinking that it's not safe, right? Well, at least in our perspective, it's this whole sense of educating our community. It's the, in my, the ask, right? Look, for us, when we first started this conversation, and Joaquin was there with us, we took a tour of the Eastern Coachella Valley and different mobile home parks and their hardships, right? And listening to their stories, which were my stories when I was growing up, right? Which is the assembly member stories when he was growing up. And so, and sometimes it's just very, very easy fixes. We were in a mobile home park that all you need to do is connect a pipe, 100 feet away from sort of like their mobile home park, right? But because there is not enough money out there to make these connections, then it just seems very impossible. You can see sort of where the pipe is at, but folks, it just looks meant to connect it. So I think there's got to be this conversation, this perspective of ensuring that the state helps, comes in and helps along with the local folks down, in our area, smart area, and start creating this education. In our area, there is a community group where you have a local water director, a bunch of community organizations that work on this, right? That not only advocate for safe drinking water, but also educate in regards to what that means, right? Because there is a couple of perspectives on what is safe, basically what, and based on what standards you're looking at, right? And so I think that's sort of like the conversation that ultimately we hope that eventually we're going to have.
I think one of the building blocks I mentioned was culture. And I don't mean just the culture from where we came from, also the culture that we come to, that has certain values and certain drivers. So for example, I mentioned earlier the whole bottled water dynamic in low income and minority communities. While the other demographic that's primarily drinking bottled water are rich people. And you know what they have in common? Higher rates of tooth decay. So that there's real consequences to what's happening with the fact that we fear the water supply. And I really agree with Carlos because the education component is key. Culture tells us that if the government is trying to protect us, like with these response levels, that somehow the sky is falling, right? And now we're demanding big expenditures when preliminary steps are made to try to protect our health. And so I think the education piece of what it means to live in a state and in a country that acts in the abundance of caution to protect our health before there's a 1 in a million chance that we would ever become ill is an underappreciated fact that we come to here in California and in the United States. Other people use our science. Just to give you an example, there's been toxicology studies on chromium-6, and there's been new protocols in the way that they determine what are acceptable levels of chromium. Well, our studies, we went through this whole process of setting a standard that was invalidated because we did not consider economic feasibility, affordability. We had some members amongst our ranks that were facing cost of $5,000 per connection per year to meet that standard. Well, in Canada, they're adopting a standard of 100 parts per billion for total chromium. And so from that perspective, there were things that California yielded that others are using to set standards that can be enforced while we're like tearing our hair out because of the fear and the misunderstanding of what the government's actually trying to do.
So I'm not a water expert here, but someone who's thought a lot about the intersection between environmental justice and social justice. I thought your question was super cool. I love UC undergrads. Thinking, just wanting to honor the fact that it's rational to not trust your institutions, given a legacy in which institutions have worked very differently across populations. And so thinking a lot about appreciating my panelists' comments a lot, but worrying that also education could seem unidirectional. And there's a reason why a lot of environmental justice work right now is really focused on transparency. So thinking and honoring the fact that ensuring that we're really aware and co-constructive and finding a way to honor the history in which and reject the history in which we have institutions not working well for communities, and a lot of distrust comes from that place of really alarming environmental justice concerns. And so there's a reason why people don't trust. And so I think transparency as part of the education component absolutely has to be there, and that co-construction to reach a better place, and recognizing that ideas come from many different places.
Okay, I've got this gentleman here in the back and then over there. Gotcha. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know if the mic's coming my way. I can be really loud. So thank you for that point. One of the things I was very interested in thinking about this is that we talk about education all the time, but we often turn to marketing as the delivery mechanism of education, and those two are different things. And I think people who live even a little bit of time in the modern world become very skeptical of something that looks like marketing. And the idea of education as being help to find your own knowledge, as opposed to marketing where you're somebody trying to convince you of something that you're supposed to just believe them, right? So I think one of the things that we often do wrong in the public sector is we turn to marketing, the tools of marketing, to try to educate, and most people who see marketing coming are extraordinarily skeptical of it. So I think it's an interesting point to have educators involved in this work. So I'm really excited to see the public agencies reaching out to the universities for this kind of help. That was actually not my question. often the services to a home are included in housing. So water service, sewer service, electricity, gas, whatever the utilities are often considered a piece of housing costs. And it seems like everybody's breaking those apart in the studies that you're doing. I'm curious whether we should actually be pushing them back together again, because a house without water is less of a house, right? And a person who has no house also has no water, right? So I'm wondering whether there's room to start pushing these thoughts back together.
That's a great question. And can I piggyback on that and say I've never really understood when we talk of land costs for housing that are, I think, a big part of housing costs, how much of that is the infrastructure cost of getting water to those houses? And I would just love to hear about that if I could piggyback.
Well, that's kind of my new pet peeve. Because, for example, in housing reform that's currently in play, there were laws that were enacted in the last year that makes it easier to build a second home on your property. But one of the things that these very laws also limit is the utilities being able to assess fees in order to, for example, enhance fire safety. Or have equal type of pressure within these properties. And so that's going to be a huge issue, especially when it comes to the older communities where the housing stock is older, where they're made out of materials that are more vulnerable. And I think it's something that we're going to have to think about. I absolutely agree. We need to kind of drive these two things together.
Yeah, and that's kind of linked to the earlier question about whose responsibility is it. And, in the water world, we're starting to break down silos between flood control districts and water agencies and recycling wastewater treatment plants and such. And the same thing with dealing with poverty and well-being is we have to break down those silos. And that's kind of the impetus for this program, and bring Giovanni here and diversity of speakers in the last slide, where it's not just about water costs, it's about relative water costs, relative to these other factors. Changing an issue here can have implications on county rates and missed schools, and that Sayori will see in her data, right? And in the housing market, changes in the housing market have influences on water affordability. So it is all kind of all hands on deck. Kind of a center like David's, with has this umbrella look at poverty that all of those types of issues.
I think there's another factor here of who's responsible for it. There was a very interesting report that came out by the Office of Environmental Health and Hazards Assessment. It's called OEHA. And what OEHA does is that they set the risk threshold for things that could be harmful to our health. And then the standards are based on their evaluation of that. And they came out with a risk tool, not a risk tool, it's an evaluation water systems' ability and their success in meeting the human right to water. So there's factors that they attach, and then everybody gets rated. I don't know that it's been publicly released. I know it was open for public comment, and I know there were comments. But one, in my opinion, of the human right to water checklist is that none of the state agencies that are responsible for planning or providing grants or doing any of those things are included in the achievement of the human right to water in California. And that's an incredible omission, and I'll tell you why. It gets in the way of assessing equity. So let's talk about the human right to water. It means that the law basically very narrowly stipulates that water needs to be available for our basic health and sanitary needs. So what happens when you have a fire, right? In Malibu, a very rich community, they had a good chunk of their water system disrupted. How fast did the state respond in meeting the needs of those people to their human right to water? I can tell you, they didn't sit around and wait 2 years or 3 years for a grant. They got their water, right? So if we don't include the state response to meeting the human right to water in some circumstances, how can people in low-income neighborhoods ever have the basis to compare whether the state is delivering services at the same level of readiness and preparedness? We have no way to weigh it. So our comment letter basically urged that the state agencies have to be a part of it, and we have to factor more than poverty into the human right to water so we can measure if the resources are being expedited in an equitable way for everybody that lacks safe drinking water under any circumstance.
Okay, I have 2 people in the queue. I want to give them each a chance to raise their question and then bring it to the panel to respond to both sets of questions, hopefully. So in the back there, and the gentleman in the blue shirt there. Go ahead.
I'll just yell. I'm good at that. Okay, so anyway, my issue is called RENA. I don't think anybody, there's a little bit of touching on it, but there isn't any direct thing. RENA means that each city has to have more housing in it. And so my city, Riverside Valley, is the newest city in the state, and the city council is going around picking out little lots and saying, okay, this is a good place for apartments, this is a good place for apartments, so forth. And the problem with that is that the water districts have to plan around the cities, what the city is coming up with. And so we can come up with all sorts of great, wonderful plans, and then the city comes along and says, no, that plan where the general plan says we are going to have lots such and such a house, single family housing, such a lot, all of a sudden that's thrown out the window, and instead they come up with this big apartment complex. And that really throws things on the water, but it also throws things on wastewater. And that's something that is not talked about at all, is the wastewater. And another thing that bugs me that was not brought up is the meter charge. And that is, you get a charge to your house called a meter charge. And that meter charge is a certain rate plus the cost of water. But the meter charge, without any turn on the water, that meter charge is huge before you even turn on the water. And that needs to be corrected too. Thank you.
All right, Eric Luge from the EV Water Authority. My first question is related to the last comment, and this question is directed to Dr. Shravy. In that, is the cost of water you're talking about, is it reflective of the fixed charge as well as the consumption charge? Because I know my agency, I work for the Indian Water Authority, the smallest meter, the meter cost is $21 a month. So I was looking at the number of that Eastern Municipal must have a very, very low fixed cost. But the question, my second question relates to the chairman of the State Water Board, Mr. Esquivel. And the question is, how do we drive economy of scale and reduce the number of water and wastewater agencies in California? Because If you have a situation where you get a $60 water bill from your water provider, and you get another $50 from your water agency, and both boards don't communicate, both staff don't communicate in setting their rates, it's just silos. What are the incentives, beyond just voluntary consolidation that is put in place to drive that economy of scale and hopefully reduce costs? Thank you.
Thank you, the great questions. Before I turn it back to the panelists, I'm going to use a little authority here and say two things. One, we're going to have a reception afterwards, and we enthusiastically welcome you to stick around. We have coffee, drinks, and some snacks and so forth. Secondly, the Blum Initiative, we're going to have the second Inland Empire Poverty Summit on April 17th in this room. We did one about a year and a half ago. It was a great success. We welcome you to come. There's a little flyer in your thinking about it. Please feel welcome to join us. And I'm going to I'll first turn to the panelists, let you think for a second and see if you want to respond as well. But first, let's go to the panelists.
Sure, just quickly, fixed costs are included, all the costs with setting up the system and the variable costs are included in our numbers. So that's taken care of. So I think that addresses the last question to me and the other question that was related to meter charges. So meter charges are included in our costs, and they should be, because people confront them and they can't avoid them even if they reduce their water use. And there's a really big, interesting discussion about the cost, relative costs of fixed costs versus variable costs, and in terms of what those should be and how you should account for those, and say in the rate structure, etc. They probably go beyond the time I have here, and I'm happy to talk with people about it afterwards. In terms of wastewater, I think of wastewater as part of the system of water costs. So you certainly want, if you're thinking about the affordability of water, you want to include, the wastewater costs as they translate into the price of water and providing water to customers. Similar, if you want to draw a larger boundary, bringing up what Greg Wilkinson said, you want to bring in the cost of water as well through inputs into food production, whatever essential elements you need.
Thank you. So to the point about RENA, and I think this gets to also the economies of scale question, which I think is really intriguing. Hopefully I demonstrated that this is a major problem that we need to address, and that I know we have people who are very passionate about water, but hopefully I convinced you that you should also be passionate about housing as a way to care about water and environmental justice. You don't get environmental justice without housing justice. And I think it's really important that we think about and try to address the ways in which the state is trying to address the affordable housing crisis through things like RENA, regional housing needs allocation, saying that you have to build a lot more, and how are we going to do it, and thinking about those plans. I absolutely think that we have to think about infrastructure as part of that work, and to the places that aren't doing it, that it's going to be a huge problem. I completely agree with that, but I think we have a huge opportunity here to also think about it as a systems problem. And when we start magnifying the problem to say we have a problem across the LA region that we're hundreds of thousands of units short, where can they go in a place that's sustainable, where we can build the infrastructure? Thinking about it in a small scale, in the Eastern Coachella Valley, it's a huge problem that we can't extend the water infrastructure. It's just cost prohibitive when we think about it at an individual project scale. But when we blow up the problem and say, no, we need many projects there, I think suddenly the costs look a lot different. And so we can think about this through an economy scale, that suddenly things become possible when we think about it in a systems way. What would our infrastructure look like if we were building at the scale that we need to do, in a way that we're engaging necessary stakeholders? So infrastructure people, but also communities, and making sure that we're protecting them against very real concerns of gentrification. I do think that if we're going to address this crisis, we treat it as a crisis, and we address it at a system scale.
Yeah, quickly.
Let me first I'll swing it back to the panel in 30 seconds.
No, just finish with the panel.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Okay, so the thing about economies of scale, it's all in our minds. Eastern Municipal Water District had a wonderful day, and they tried twice, and I think it was too early for its times. But what their bill recognized, it was a consolidation bill. It recognized that the economies of scale already exist when you have larger systems that are willing to help smaller systems, and it set up a framework so that you could begin aggregating some of the smaller systems through a variety of configurations. I won't get into the detail, it was pretty complicated. But my point is that the economies of scale exist when the larger systems are allowed to implement, for example, regulations and drive the cost of technology down. We had it, for example, with the arsenic standard, where the larger systems, we had 5 years to implement the standard. The larger systems were able to drive the technology in such a way that smaller systems were then able to experiment and reduce the cost of the treatment even further. In fact, one community, the 29 Palms Water District, 75% severely disadvantaged, they have their own lab that allowed them to capitalize on the technology that was brought in by the larger entities and drive down the cost of treatment for themselves. So my point is, the economies of scale exist. What doesn't exist is the legal framework to allow those economies to work because of Prop 218 and the things that limit how we define common benefits.
We'll come back to the panel too, if you guys have anything to say.
Well, I just want to say thank you. You know, my job is made very easy or easier because of what are incredible minds across this state. Just to touch on a few points, regionalization through consolidation in these economies of scale, but it has to be driven at the community level, and it has to be with community buy-in and acknowledgement, because I can promise you the boards of those water districts are certainly not going to do it amongst themselves. And so it has to be from the people who want to see a better system, who want to see a better and more sort of regionalized and integrated way that their needs are being served on water writ large. So just thank you for everyone here.
Thanks, Joaquin. Okay, I'm going to give our panelists, I'm going to give Kurt 1 minute if he wants it, and Sayuri 1 minute if she wants it, because she hasn't had a chance to speak, but you're not obligated. Just to be sure we give everybody the opportunity. Kurt, do you have anything, since this is partly Kurt's whole idea here to do this event, so I'll give you 1 minute, and I'm timing you.
So I shouldn't do it, yeah. No, I just want to thank the panelists and Eastern and the Blum Center for supporting this timely topic. We all have a lot to learn. I think discussions like this certainly help us move down that path very cost effectively. It is a systems approach here in terms of dealing with low-income households, poverty. Water is linked to social services, it's linked to housing, it's linked to elections. So we all talk to one another moving forward. I do want to bring up a point that Alan brought up a couple of times. This is Prop 218. I think we need to really rethink this. This is really hamstringing our agencies in terms of how we can price water for efficiency, for scarcity, for affordability purposes. So I would make a request that Chairman Escobar convene a panel to talk about Prop 218 at some point. I know it's really hand-wringing, but I'm glad Alan brought that up. It is a really big issue. But anyways, yeah.
Sayuri, would you like to add anything?
You know, and, for me, it's really, we can't underestimate what public perception means to our communities and how it drives behaviors and lifestyles. And from there, it drives people's actions. And so, in all of our programs, what we continue to work on, it is difficult working in a huge bureaucracy, is that we have to meet people where they are. We cannot prescribe what we think is best for our community without their input, and that's the most important thing.
And I'll just conclude by thanking Chair Escobar, thanking our panelists, but also thanking you folks for coming out today and engaging in hopefully this meaningful discussion. Thank you.